Okay, Avivah, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Shalom, hello everybody. Good to see your faces again. Those of you who are allowing me to see your faces, can I put in an appeal for any brave spirits to put on your cameras? I really do understand the instinct to hide. I have it myself. Sometimes I'd really rather not be on camera. And nevertheless, if you have it in you, if it's in your heart to put on the camera, then I'd appreciate it very much. It gives me a sense of who I'm speaking to, even in these tiny little pictures. Thank you for those who did just now. This shir is dedicated to the memory
Excuse me.
Yes?
I'm ill. I can't put the camera on. I can hardly talk.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's all right, Ellen. Yeah, feel well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. This class is dedicated to the memory of Bracha Odenheimer, Bracha Bat Yaakov Meir Sarah. Another introductory comment I wanted to make. It occurred to me that in the past I've encouraged you to send me your questions and your thoughts, even if we didn't manage to talk about them during the class. So again, I repeat this very warmly. I love receiving responses in the mail. And so if you do have any responses or thoughts or questions, my email is zornberg@netvision.net.il. And with this, we move into this great Parsha, Lech Lecha, which really begins our particular history. Everything else has been prehistory, as far as we are concerned. Prehistory is an important level of history. But now we move more into Zoom. Now we are in focus. And we begin with a man called Avram, who is going to be the father of a great nation. That's the meaning behind his name, Avram. And we begin with some local knowledge about him. The fact that his father has left their place of origin, called Ur Kasdim, and started a journey towards Eretz Canaan. And the fact that he stopped the journey midway and settled down somewhere before getting to Eretz Canaan. That was at the end of last week's Parsha. We also learned family business about Avram, that he and his brother took wives. We haven't heard this detail about any of the generations up to now. Up to now, all the generations of male fathers somehow managed to have children without mentioning a wife. Each generation is named as simply the male Yalad, Holid. And that's all. And it's a very minor difference, you might say, that here there is a sense that they took wives. And then in this week's Parsha, of course, we have the great command of God, Lech Lecha, and Abraham's journey towards the land of Canaan. But I want to approach our story through a larger perspective, again, perhaps a kind of poetic perspective, and to think of what we were talking about last week, that last week what we were speaking about was God's desire to create the world, and then God's losing that desire to have a created world. And then at the end, God vows that he will never do that destructive thing again. In other words, that his desire is now back in place. And that's the way it's put, actually, in certain Hasidic sources, that there is a sense in the world that God's desire for the world is now vital, that it's back in place, and that God really wants that there should be a world. According to a famous midrash, what did God want a world for? Ultimately, it was God wanted a world in spite of the fact that he knew that man would sin. That is, one of the midrashic undercurrents. I won't go into the details of the references now. Why was it that God didn't restrain himself from creating a world if he knew it was going to run into such bad trouble? difficult times, because he was looking forward to there being what he called a tzaddik. For the sake of the tzaddikim, for the sake of the righteous people who would be in the world, God didn't hesitate, as it were. It wasn't even a conflict at this point. Once he had gone through the actual destruction of the world, there was no longer a conflict about the world. There has to be a world. Why? Because there will be tzaddikim. And I want to take that in a very broad sense. You know, I don't want to translate it necessarily, but just the sense, not just technically tzaddikim, but there will be people whose hearts are in the right place. And for that, it's worth creating a world. For that, it's worth having children, even though you know that there'll be a lot of problems, including death, that will happen to those children. So it's worth it. It's more than worth it because of tzaddikim. And last week, we spoke about that desire to create as something that human beings also have. The desire to use one's hands like God used his hands. Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam min ha'afar. Yes, that God formed, molded the human being with the use of his creative hands. And there is no shyness about the anthropomorphism, right? There is no inhibition. The Torah doesn't feel wretched to tell us that God has hands. Now, what kind of philosophical statement is that? It's a statement of tremendous power. That is the creative soul, which is in God and is in human beings. And we spent some time last week thinking about what happens to human beings when they are creative and when they use their hands to creative ends. And this week, I want to go on with the theme of water, with the theme of the flood, in a sense, water and earth, and what happens when you combine them, to the third stage of the evolution of God's design. There was a first stage of creation, which was foiled, and then a second stage in which man picked up on creativity. Noach also wants to be creative. He wants to shape and form the world. And this third stage will have to do with, and I want to just say it very cryptically now, because we're talking about poetry. I want to say God now wants to create a man. Now he wants to create someone, all right, let me just say this, who will approximate to that original dream, the divine dream of a tzaddik. Now, I don't know if that works for you or doesn't work for you, to put it like that. I imagine not everyone will like that, what I've just said. I don't mean it, as I say again defensively, I don't mean it in a technical sense, you know, a tzaddik who keeps all the mitzvot and so on. I mean a fulfillment of the divine desire in a human being. And Avram is going to be that. And the question arises right away, but everywhere, particularly in Ramban. All the commentaries ask this. Why did God choose Avram? We have no evidence that he was such a person. At the moment when God chooses Avram and says to him, Lech lecha, leave everything you know and go to a place which I will show you. We'll talk a lot about all that. At that moment, Avram hasn't proved himself at all. So he's not a tzaddik. You can't call him a tzaddik. How does God know this, of all people, is the right person to choose? And that's a question that's asked very seriously, because somewhere we do believe that the Torah has a kind of ethical thrust to it, that people are not chosen arbitrarily. So what was the basis of this choice? And I want to be saying that the basis of the choice is God's sense that Avram is a person who can create himself. That's, it's a very cryptic, right? That Avram has a creative power which goes deep inwards, not only outwards into the world, to change the world, to bring out into the world aspects of himself and change the world, but to change himself. That's a self-transformation power. which is a very strange idea when you come to think of it. You know, how many things that one makes have a power to transform themselves? There are certainly inventions that seem to have some of that power, but that's what God wants at this point. And so God says to Avram, Lech Lecha. And those two words in the Torah, I want to say, are poetic words. They contain in themselves metaphors. They are not just practical words that mean get going, start traveling. They don't only have one clear meaning that is clear and explicit in the words. That would not make poetry, as we saw last week. That would be at best a story. It would be the beginning of a story, of an adventure out in the world, a journey. But that Lech Lecha, especially with that reflexive Lecha, go to yourself, with the play on the word Lech and Lecha. You know, that's pure fancy, you know, that's imagination. To play on these two words as if they're the same word, they're written like the same word, without vowels, as if to say that's a different kind of journey now. This journey is one where you're going to need your imagination. And at this point, I want to take up what I think of as a wonderful passages in a book by Gaston Bachelard, French philosopher, psychoanalyst, I'm very enriched by. The book is called Water and Dreams. And one of the things he says actually in these passages is that water has its own dreams. Water has its own dreams, right? The hand has its dreams and water has its dreams. And what I'd like to do now is to look with you at the end of the source page, right? That's where I put it. It's a quotation from Bachelard, number 13, in the English, right at the end, in the English sources. Yes? Got it? Yeah. Talking now about the worker, the human worker, which means someone who likes to mold reality, to shape reality. At the beginning of his work, the worker's first thought is for water. Water is his first auxiliary. Water is not his first medium. Earth is his first medium, right? Clay, no, not clay, the basic ingredient of clay. Earth, sand, dust is his first ingredient. But the first auxiliary, what he needs to make that work, he needs two elements, is going to be water. And that's why that's the worker's first thought. He doesn't have to think about the earth. The earth is just there. But he thinks about water. And for Bachelard, that's not just a practical taking of water and adding it to the earth. It's a thought that somewhere, it's a reverie, that's the word he likes to use. The dream, the fantasy of someone who works is, here I have clay, here I have earth, I need to have water. And already he begins working in his mind. His mind begins to imagine what will happen then. And then he does it actually with his hands, yes. It is through the action of water that the first reverie of the worker who molds begins. Therefore, it should not seem surprising that water is dreamed in active ambivalence. Now, these are very dense sentences. That the dream of water is an ambivalent dream. It has to do with two things and not with one thing. You don't dream. Powerful dreams are not about one simple thing. They're about two opposites. There is earth and there's water. There is the solid and there's the liquid. There is the thing that seems to stand against you, that needs in some way to be broken down. And then there is water, which is fluid. And what does water do? Carrying on with the passage about reveries and ambivalence. There is no reverie without ambivalence and no ambivalence without reverie. Now that's a poetic statement. You have to start thinking now to check, is that true? Do I understand what he's saying? Have I got a meaning for what he's saying? Is that, that's what he's inviting you to do that. He's not inviting you to take the meaning straight off the page. What do you mean? Is that true? That there's no dream without ambivalence? That there's no ambivalence without dreaming? Right. And I don't want to start translating it. I'm leaving that to you. Let's just go on. What does he say then? Now, water is dreamed by turns in its roles as softener and as binder. Water has two functions. It's not just one thing. First of all, the first thing it does is it softens things that are hard and ingrained together, a piece of plaster or something. You put a lot of water on it and it falls apart. It softens and it falls apart. That's what God did to the world in the flood. As Rashi points out, God made the world out of combining water and earth, and then he just put a lot of water. He threw a lot of water at the world, and it fell apart. That's all you have to do. So it's a destroyer. Water is a very powerful destroyer and a very powerful creator as well. It separates and it binds together. Now that I'm cutting it there. He goes on, and it's hard to cut him. He's really so fruitful. I think it's enough. It's a germ. Water makes you uneasy somewhere. You're not peaceful with water because you know that its action on other materials is going to be paradoxical. It's going to do one thing and another. It's going to break things apart, the things that you thought you had nice solidly together, and then it's going to rebind them in different forms. Once you've got a nice viscous material like mud or clay, then you can make it into something else. And it's only when you're dealing with an ambivalent, right, an ambivalent material that you have opposite feelings about, that something creative begins to happen. Now, if it's very single-minded, it's not so creative. You just know this is a good material, I'm going to use it for the good. It's usually when there is some kind of tension. You'll see it in operation as we go on. So he goes on to say then that one of his main ideas is that there's two kinds of creativity. One is creativity that has to do with form, with creating a nice form, shape of thing, but with surfaces that you can enjoy to look at. That is one kind of pleasurable creativity. The other way of thinking of creativity is not what it looks like from the outside, but the work that's done from the inside with matter. That is the work of the molder. The molder is not working with pretty surfaces. Unlike other artists who, for instance, chip away from a block of stone. They are working at the surface. They're trying to get rid of stuff that they don't want in order to achieve the surface they want. But the person who molds, that's a particular form of creativity, which we're interested in, which has to do with water and earth, works from the inside. That the hands of the artisan, of the artist, are in there deep inside, in which there is something. He uses this extraordinary expression. He talks about the depth of substances, the inner space inside, the penetration of the hands into that inwardness. That inwardness can be considered the human heart on one level, yeah. And then he says that inwardness, which we're talking about here, is in the depths of matter there grows an obscure vegetation. That is, there is a growing power right at the heart of things, like grass and growing things. You think you're dealing with inert matter, but if you get right into it, it begins to be dynamic. It begins to move and change and interact with each other. The parts interact and something different is created. And that's what he's trying to get at here. And he's talking about everything from simply the facts of life, male and female, the interactions between them and so on every level. and other forms of creativity. And I think that's about, we talk about taking the matter in hand. I mean, I'm trying to discipline myself not to spend too long on this. We take the matter in hand, right? These dead metaphors, these very unlively metaphors. We mean we're taking the finished object, and here we got it, we hold its shape. But actually, it could mean something different. To take it in hand is what the artist does. He takes all that raw, unfinished material and he applies his hands to it. And that means going into the depths. And it means discovering a kind of vitality, which has to do with tzmicha. It has to do with growth. And it starts with the animal, with vegetable life. And then it goes on to all other kinds of life. One of the great pleasures of the artist of this kind, and I think this is all I will allow myself now, is, he says, first of all, you make forms of various, every child loves doing that, making forms, but every child likes doing the other thing as well, which is to make forms by deforming what you've just made. That is, somewhere, again, there is this double impulse in the artist, to make things look beautiful and to make things look as rudimentary and ugly and unformed as possible. To get rid of forms that are there, that are not satisfactory for some reason, and to make them into something else. And that is, for him, that is the most powerful urge of this kind of artist. To deform, to form by deforming. It's a kind of shocking word. Deforming. There are gentler words he could have used, but he's not concerned to be gentle. That's not really what he's looking for. He's trying to say very, very elemental things to do with the elements of human life. And I think that's where I leave the metaphor and Bachelard just now. And begin to look closely at these poetic words, lech lecha. And I'm thinking now, how do I want to show that they are poetic? How do I want to show that if you get your hands into them, they begin to take all kinds of forms? They can flower in the world. And the obvious way to do it is to look at Midrash. It's really very simple, as simply as a first stage, at any rate, is to look at what the Midrash does with these words. And before I get to the Midrash, let's just notice something just about the actual meaning of the word. Yomer Hashem el Avram lech lecha, and then I'll just read the one or two verses after that. Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetcha u'mibeit avicha el haaretz asher areka ve'escha legoy gadol va'avarecha va'agadla shmecha ve'yeh bracha va'avarecha mevarechecha u'mekalelcha aor v'nivruchu b'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama. That's God's speech. How many times that final cha, lech lecha, that is, God is addressing a person and emphasizing over and over and over again, you are someone that I am going to do things to. That you have certain relationships to the world, and somewhere you are going to have to spoil those relationships, first of all, your land, your house of your father, yeah, meaning that you could say is part of your present form. Who you are now is these things. You are attached to these things. These are yours, and God is not trying to be gentle about it. Oh, these are not really you. Go and look for your true you. I know I'm being a little vulgar here, but it's not exactly that. It's acknowledging the ties that link a person to the form that he finds himself in. This is my form now. And then the ability and even the need to deform that, to detach yourself from these things. Why? God doesn't say. He doesn't say that's because I'm commanding you. It's almost as if he's requesting rather than really commanding. He's just saying, do, and be a blessing. How is he supposed to do that? How can you tell someone, it's not very clear, I want you to be a blessing. there are times when we do talk like that, but then we are in poetic mode, because then we're saying, I can't tell you clearly what I want you to do. I'm giving you an image that if it speaks to you, will give you an inkling, will give you an inner sense of what I mean, not just an external sense. If I'm asked to be a blessing to all around me, that's not nothing. Something is being suggested there, but there's a lot of suggestion in it. And here is a man who is now at the center of God's focus. Ha, 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 ha. You, lech lecha. So if you just listen to the passage without even really engaging with it, you get that sense of God's wanting a new kind of relationship with a human being. That human being is going to reshape himself in some way. And God is urging him on in this task. So the meaning then for Rashi, now let's have a look at some of the sources in your page, just to pick up on some of the things we've been saying. For instance, we'll start with number 2. We'll get back to number 1, I hope, a little later. Lech lecha, Rashi says, means simply, and Rashi is not necessarily being very poetic here. In fact, he sounds very pragmatic. It's a different approach. Lech lecha, letovatcha ulehanatcha. For your benefit and for your good. Lech lecha simply means God is promising Avram, if you do what I'm asking you to do now, to leave everything and go, then it'll be for your good. It's a promise. It's a promise of benefit. It's a kind of incentive, you might say. It's really rather pragmatic. It's not appealing to anything spiritual in Avram by saying that. He's promising him reward, basically. And he goes on to be specific about it, Rashi in his understanding, that God means something very concrete. We know already that Avram and Sarai are barren, that they have no child. And so their obvious need is for children. So God says, what that includes is, if you go on this journey, when you get there, I will make you into a great nation. But here, you will not merit having children. And moreover, I will make you famous in the world. Now, these are incentives. It's very down to earth. It's not nothing spiritual about it as such. These are incentives to travel for your good and for your benefit. That's how Rashi puts it. The Zohar will put it in the other way. And I'm not going to explain, I don't think I can, explain why Rashi chooses to take this approach. I'm sure there's something interesting if one can find it. But the Zohar takes the other approach. L'tikuncha o legarmecha. What is that lecha? Go for you, not for your benefit, but for your recreation. That the you there is now is going to become raw material if you choose, if you go that way, if you opt for that. Tikkun is remaking something, making it better, and legormacha actually means to bring you into being. So here you have a human being who is in a way being asked to recreate himself. Okay, let's stay with Rashi for the time being. God then goes on to be more specific and says, if you go on this journey, I will make you into a great nation. What does that imply? What's the connection between a journey and having lots of children, being fruitful? And Rashi says, it's very intriguing. Rashi says that what we're being told here is that this is a paradox. I know I'm asking you to do something that's counterproductive. It doesn't make sense. And that idea that the journey is not just, an open-ended journey, we'll come to that. Go to the place which I will show you, that he has to travel without knowing where he's going. But it's more than that traveling in itself is not what you do when you are infertile. It's not good for the hormones. It's not good. You want a stable life. You don't want to be running around all over the place, especially your wife, let's say, you and your wife. So God is saying here, I know I'm asking for something that sounds absurd, but listen to me. You are going to have to, if you go into the depths of the ambivalence that you're going to feel about this, you're going to feel very ambivalent about this journey because you know it's not good for you. And nevertheless, out of that, something will emerge. And so the expression that Rashi uses is that traveling mima'etet, diminishes the vital force that has to do with having children, procreative force. It also diminishes one's ability to make money, to become rich. And so God promises Avram, but I will make you rich. And the third thing that that traveling doesn't help is shame, becoming famous. If you never stay long in one place, enough in one place to build up a reputation, and you have a nomadic existence, then you're not going to have a great name in the world. And God therefore says specifically, these 3 brachot are what God focuses on, not just to promise Abraham good things, but to say these are good things that you will, in a way, have created for yourself by doing the unexpected thing, by doing the counter-indicated thing, because I ask you, you will do something that doesn't make sense to you. And therefore, maybe it will bring out of you something unexpected. And God blesses him that should be so. But the process is not going to be a sensible process. And that's what's being stressed here. And then, finally, the last Rashi of that pasuk, Asher Areka, to the land which I will show you, Lo gilalo haaretz miyad. God didn't reveal to him the land, his destination, right away. Lo gilalo. Again, it's a negative. Notice how Rashi, in a way, is being negative at every point, except perhaps the first point. Go, it'll be for your benefit. But even that, I think we can now see that when God says to him, it'll be for your benefit, he doesn't just mean it as a general incentive. He means it in terms of the paradox. That in spite of the fact that it doesn't look as if it's going to be beneficial, that it's not what you would have chosen to do, nevertheless, afal pikein. And that's what Rashi, I think we found an answer here. That's why Rashi chooses this line. He doesn't talk about recreating yourself because he wants us to feel the problem. What is so hard for Abraham? Go to the land which I will show you. It isn't just that God doesn't tell him where he's going, but that God tells him that he's not telling him. Lo gilalo. Rashi is telling us specifically that God is not telling him. Why? Why does God hold out on Avram? Why not relieve his curiosity? And the answer that's given is Lechabeva be'enav, to make the land precious in his eyes. That is, in a sense, the fact that he doesn't know that there's a mystery about his destination and that he's traveling open-ended all the time. On the one hand, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very frustrating. What is it like getting up every morning and feeling a little mad? Tir'u meshugazeh, says the Midrash. That's what people are saying about him. Look at this crazy man. He walks and he doesn't know where he's walking. Just keeps walking. Now that's craziness, even in the literal meaning of the English word. To be crazed is to be like crazed pavements, all over the place, not having a nice geometric shape, not having a neat form. And that is the experience that God is putting him through now. And the effect, strangely, will be to make it more precious to him. And I wonder about that. To make what more precious to him? Why will there be a certain kind of love that grows in him because of the frustration? Not despite the frustration, but that somewhere it will open up something in him, not just close things in him, right? The obvious the appearance is that it's going to close down things for him. And no, and here is this, that when something is a mystery, when something is a mystery, let's say, maybe as Bachelard does, it becomes a subject of reverie. If there's a conflict, if there's an ambivalence, I do want to travel, I don't want to travel, it's not good, then there is a reverie. Something deep in one's unconscious is called on and comes up to meet that ambivalence. It's not something my reason can deal with. So I dream about it at night. There's something that begins to happen in a different part of the mind. Okay, I think that will do for the first Rashi, although there's always more. And then I want to go on to, I think we'll go straight to, yes, let's go straight to number 4 now. The first Midrash on Lech Lecha in Breshit Rabbah. And this is the one that is quoted universally, right? This is probably the basic Midrash that has intrigued its readers and has been quoted and has been many drashot have been made about it. What is Lech Lecha in the Midrash now? Now we're going off into another world. And this is the world of metaphors. What is Lecha? Lech Lecha. Number 4. Vayomer Hashem el Avram Lech Lecha me'artzecha. Rabbi Yitzchak Patach. Rabbi Yitzchak began quoting from Tehillim. So that's the first crazy move in Midrash. Not direct, straightforward. You have a pasuk, interpret the pasuk. No, let's take on another pasuk. Right. One pasuk wasn't enough. We'll take on another one that has nothing to do with this one on the surface. It comes from a different part of Tanakh. It's about a different subject. It's about a bride who is being urged to go and travel towards her bridegroom, whom she doesn't know. And that's the metaphor that's used in the book of Psalms. Shim'i bat uri, listen, O daughter, and see, re'i, v'hati oznech, and incline your ear, v'shikchi amech uvet avich, and forget your people and the house of your father. Now, this is a young woman being told to forget her people and the house of her father and go towards her unknown bridegroom and keep her eyes and ears alert. You might have thought that if she's being asked to forget her family, the image would be, blind yourself, make yourself deaf to all the cries of your family who are trying to keep you here. And just make yourself determined like a rock, I'm just going to do, I'm not affected by anything. I'm going to do what I have to do, grit my teeth. No, shim'i re'i, keep your faculties open, in spite of the fact that you're being asked to cut yourself off at this point, to forget. Now, that first part of the Midrash is then followed by a part that has apparently nothing to do with it. And I want to just omit it for the time being. We'll come back to it. And just look at the end of the Midrash, where we return to our original context with the bride. So we go back to there. It's 2 lines from the end. How does the pasuk go on then? Go on there. V'yitav hamelech yofiech ki hu Adonayich. And the king whom you are going to marry, he will desire your beauty because he is your Lord. He will be your Lord and Master. I don't want to read this in too prejudicial a way. I don't think we should overemphasize the mastership, but just the husband who is every traditional bride understood this. The power differential is just simply part of reality. But here there are additional factors. that she is going to acknowledge and live in erotic unity with this person whom she doesn't know. And in order to do that, she has to cast herself off from everything that she does know, which is her present world, her present sources of authority and meaning. Right, the house of her father. That's also a source of authority. Your father is also your overlord in that traditional sense. I hope we can keep our feminist sensibilities down a little bit at this point. Yeah, it's there, but you get it. And that is used now as an image, as a metaphor for Avraham in his task now. Why does the Midrash do that? It's such a different context. Avram is not a bride. He's not a young woman. This is not an erotic context. Right? It's really different. And yet, the Midrash wants to say, first of all, it's not so different. It's not so different if you're prepared to read the Torah as poetry. And this is the piece I want to add this year, because I have this theme of the Torah as poetry, to the way I've always taught it in the past. In the past, I would simply have said, as everyone says, that the Midrash is creative. The Midrash is poetic. And so when it reads the words lech lecha, somewhere it begins to associate with another kind of journey in which you will have to leave everything that is you and go to another place where you will find everything that is you, but a different you. You will be transformed. You will become, from being a young girl, you will be you will be a married woman, right? There is that kind of gap between the two yous. It's a very different person. And the difficulty of that for the maiden, for our young maiden, to make that cut with her innocent self. So the Midrash is saying, yes, right? The Midrash is using creative energy here to expand, let me say it differently, to enter into the depths of the situation that Avraham is in. So the Midrash is being imaginative here. Now I want to add that I think, really I have a lot of thinking to do about this and seeing how it works in many texts. I think that the Midrash takes it as an assumption, assumes that the Torah is poetic. This is not Chazal just coming and being fancy free, and saying, oh, well, it's like this, and it's like that, and it's like that. Their understanding of the text is sufficiently deep that the surface meaning is just obviously couldn't be the whole story of the Torah, because they sense the depths. They are going in there and they're feeling the depths in the words. And that it's a sensibility. It's not necessarily a rational understanding, although it gets supported by rational things. It's a sensibility. It's an interest in depth. And if you're interested in depth, then you will feel depth. And the reason you feel it, turning it upside down, is because it's there. Because it's actually there. The Torah has such depths. The Torah is not just an object that you make use of for your imaginative enjoyment. That there is that in the Torah. Now, this is very fraught. What I'm saying, it can be many kinds of objections and ifs and buts can be made. But I want to take it step by step, and we'll see how we go. What this daughter is feeling most of all, it seems to me, is anxiety. That's what the Midrash wants to pick up. Avraham is being asked, we like to say, to act on faith, to travel on faith. Another way of putting that is that he feels anxiety, because the greatest acts of faith are those that happen out of a background of anxiety and fear. I can say it like that. What do I mean exactly? There can be no greater anxiety than leaving a world that was your world and going off into the unknown. God is asking for faith. What what is this faith? Where is he going to find it? Is it just a theoretical faith? Well, we'll see what the Rambam says. For the Rambam, we'll get to it in a little while, and maybe I won't say so much more. For the Rambam, it's an intellectual discernment in Abraham. Abraham is a philosopher who, from the earliest years of his life, from the age of 3 to the age of 40, there are different versions, has been working things out in his mind about how there is only one God, and all the rest are stupid fantasies of these pagans that I'm surrounded with. And he has come to certain logical conclusions. These are Aristotle's conclusions about the prime mover of the world. He's got it all worked out, well constructed in his mind before he moves a step, before he actually moves. And that's a certain kind of faith. That's the Rambam's faith, knowing that it's a truth, right? That you know with all parts of you that this is true, and therefore you're of course, if God tells you to go, you go. Right? We'll look at that a little more closely later. But according to the Midrash, what is this faith? What is the bride's experience? And there you can't talk about the bride as a big intellectual. You know, we don't have the benefit of modern experience of brides being big intellectuals. Right? This is a different world. And so what you have is anxiety. And I think here of anxiety, not just as a mood or as a feeling, you know, as an affect, but I'm thinking of a book by Hubert Fingeret, French philosopher, where he says this. He says anxiety means a genuinely new organization of the ego. It means not just that the world around me has changed, but that I have changed and I don't recognize myself. That some things have fallen apart in me, ego. What is the ego in a person? His understanding of the ego is that part of me that wants to make meaning, that it needs to make meaning of everything. So that if I see things as meaningless, I am deeply distressed. It's not a nothing for me. And Abraham had been living at some point, we don't know how, you know, maybe only till the age of 3, but, you know, we don't know that in the text. He had been living for a certain good long time, perhaps, without, in a meaningful world, in a world that made sense to him, until he began, as the Rambam puts it, l'shotet b'da'ato, to roam around in his mind, to allow his mind to become a roamer, you know, to become not fixed in a given state of things, and begin to ask questions which makes something of the word I have in my mind is not a dignified word, and it's not really what I would like to say. It means someone who is compelled to travel all the time. All right, let's say a nomad, rather than a settled person. But that's very distressing for anyone but an intellectual who's going to build a new structure right away in his mind. If you find that the basis has been taken out from under you, then you are distressed. And that's a state of ego disorganization. You don't have an I anymore, in some quite radical sense. And that's how he wants to understand it. And then he wants to say that this is a necessary process for growth. That not easy, that ambivalent experience that one certainly mostly doesn't enjoy, can begin to move one towards new ways of organizing oneself, of putting oneself together, of creating some kind of movement. What it may give birth to is a new sense of insight into the world. I look back at what there was before, and I then have a sense of insight. I don't just see it from the outside, I see it from the inside, and it contains the seeds now that help me move on. Either help me reject that, or on the contrary, help me to build on that, but with a difference. No longer from the inside entirely. I go inside, I look for the seeds, And then I try to make it mean something else, because that no longer works for me. I can't do that anymore. And so he will say that that is a necessary movement in life if there is to be growth. And he is to say also, he says also that it's helped by a presentiment of a future order. Now, that's a very hopeful thing to say, that even when everything feels like chaos all around, that the ego sees meaninglessness all around and even inside itself, nevertheless, there's some little seed inside oneself that is a presentiment of a future order. I don't know what it is. I can't see it yet, but I can see that there will be something. Now, that's a different kind of seeing. It's a different kind of seeing and a different kind of hearing. It's a kind of hyper attentiveness, maybe, that suddenly you become sharpened to seeing things that you didn't have to look for before. And that is how he tries to present this problem of anxiety. The neurotic reaction to anxiety is to deny the anxiety for him. I find this very helpful, actually. That what the neurotic does is not the one who feels anxiety, which we tend often to feel. I must be so neurotic because I'm feeling anxious. It's not that. It's I'm feeling anxious and I acknowledge I'm feeling anxious. I know that and I think about it, and maybe I can begin to dream about it. Somewhere I can let go somewhere of the shape that I want to find again and see what happens when I go right in there, put my hands right down in there. And that's easier said than done. That's not an easy thing to really engage with anxiety. That's what Paul Tillich will call courage. That's the courage to be. Courage is to do that, and it's one of the hardest things. And our history as a people begins with that. It begins with the words lech lecha, which have in their very meaning the idea of that kind of anxiety, the willingness to take that on if there is to be a tikkun, if there's to be a new order, which will not just be imposed from outside. You know, God won't just, it's not Har Sinai, right? That's a different stage. Before Har Sinai, there has to be a person who can accept Har Sinai. There has to be a person, lech lecha. Who is this person? Is in the germs of it are in the Avram who travels, but something will have to develop. If you look now at the Rambam, we have more or less we've said some things about already. Perhaps one more point that I'd like to make about the Rambam is, if you I'm not going to read it through, it'll take too long. But first of all, just to notice how he's described at the beginning of the passage. This is in the laws of idolatry. And it describes Avram as someone who is deeply embedded in idolatry. The word that's used is mushka. He was deeply rooted in some way, implanted in an idolatrous culture. So don't be too facile about it. Oh, there were a few idols, and then even as a child, he knew this was ridiculous, and he went around smashing the idols, because after all, if they let themselves be smashed, it shows they have no power. Now that, it may have some strengths, that midrash, but it is making it a kind of child's activity, as if it's not so obvious to Avram from the beginning that there was no problem for him. Maybe there is a problem. Maybe it's not so easy to come at the conclusions that he wanted to. He had leshotet bedato. He started off as a baby in a way, nigmal, when he was weaned as a baby. Right, the weaning process at age 3, maybe that's what it's intended to suggest, is a movement away from childish things. It's a movement to the difficult world of things that are not just mother's milk, are not so intimate and not so easy to come by. And then he became a giant, so that's the Rambam's thumbnail sketch of the beginning of Lech Lecha. Kishenigmal etan zu, when this giant was first weaned. He was a giant in the end, but he didn't start off as a giant. He started off as a baby who needed weaning. So we have a sense of development. And then he began to roam in his mind while he was still small, and he began to think by day and by night. And he's a full-time philosopher. Right away, you'll get the sense it's all in the world of mind. It's in the world of intellect for the Rambam. And that for Rambam, the model for his idea of Avram is clearly Socrates on some clear level. Because Socrates is the person who in the end has his life threatened by the incendiary ideas, right? The revolutionary ideas that he is spreading in the city. He is talking to young people, he's spreading corrupting ideas, and that's exactly how the Rambam describes Avram. That once he had arrived at his final, full version of the truth of the world and its relation to God, let's say at the age of 40, that was the end of one stage of his development. It's all very neatly systematized, right? He spends 37 years thinking and building an intellectual structure. And then once he's got it, then he doesn't really need to think anymore. What he needs to do now is teach. And teaching means now discussing with people and having Socratic dialogues with people and bringing them to the point where they have no choice but to agree with him. And that's what he's doing to the young people of his environment. And that's why the government is against him. And they want to throw him into prison, and they want to threaten him with death. It's put a little vaguely exactly what threatens him. Although I think at some point it does say that they wanted to put him into a furnace. Bikesh hamelech lahorgo v'na'aseh lo nes v'yatsa l'chirut. He was put into a prison, and the king wanted to kill him, and a miracle was done from him, and he escaped. Now that's a way of referring. It's a kind of adult way of referring to that story of the fiery furnace, which is a well-known midrash about how Abraham, as a very young child, was brought to court by his father because he had smashed his father's idols. And he's thrown into a fiery furnace by way of execution, and God saves him. And the Rambam wants to have just a trace of that myth, if you will, in his intellectual, philosophical passage here, but not more than that. Maybe you'll vaguely remember it, but basically it's something different. God did a miracle for him. He was threatened by his environment, like Socrates, and God did a miracle for him. And God told him basically that if now he should leave and he should go on with his career as a spiritual teacher. And he goes around and he travels and he gathers many disciples around him, more and more and more, until he has crowds of people following him. And he becomes a spiritual teacher, and it's all based on personal dialogues. I find that it's very indicative. What is the way you really make souls, in the words of the Torah, lasot nefashot, in the midrash on the poetic level? It doesn't mean gathering people around you. It means really affecting lives, affecting the souls of people. And you can't do that by mass rallies, by having a big revivalist meeting. At least I'm asserting that you can't do that. There may be people who disagree. You do that by an intimate one-on-one intellectual discussion, right? For the Rambam, it's obvious it has to be an intellectual discussion in which you find that the other person finds that using his own intellect, this teacher, using the student's intellect, the teacher has shown the student that he's not right. And again, he has put the student in that slightly anxious position of acquiring a soul. No, I'm going to have to think again about where I am and what I'm going to do. And it's a number of those people who then follow Avram. That's the Rambam's version of Lech Lecha. That is, in this case, go into the depths of intellectual understanding that you have acquired and bring them out into the world, like a great spiritual teacher. excuse me. That is Socrates, and Socrates, of course, really was killed for his pains. He was executed, and Avram is the exception. You know, he is our version, and God does a miracle for him, and he's not. But he was in the same kind of danger. And here's now I want to come back to the midrash we started with the bride. Go back to number 4. We had the bride being told that she should incline her ear, she should see, she should hear, and leave the house of her father. Forget the house of her father. You look at the next part of the midrash in number 4. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Mashal Echad. This in itself is a parable for another story. So it's a parable, right? It's a translation of the word lecha into the bride mode, and the bride mode is also a parable now for something else. What is it that like? Mashal, a mashal for someone, echad, who was traveling from place to place, passing over. To over, it's a very simple word. It means to leave one place and flit through it and go on to the next place. So it's a kind of flitting existence. It's a kind of volatile movement. You are here, and then you're there, and then you're there. So there's that feeling of unsettledness, that you're never really in a place. You want to be in a place. But he's moving mimakom lemakom. And then he saw v'ra'a bira achat doleket. Here's the famous castle on fire. And he sees a castle on fire, a big building, a palace on fire. He said, Tomar, would you say that this palace, this castle, is without anyone in charge? Would you say that? What does he mean by the question? Does he mean it's on fire and therefore it looks as if no one's in charge? I think that's probably the most plausible way of understanding it. Is that he saw this castle on fire, and that's what he said. He said, is it possible to say, okay, no. Right. I think the basic meaning is, would you say means it's plausible to say. It seems to make sense that there's no one in charge of this world because it's on fire. It seems to be burning up around me. There is so much wrong with what's going on that that it's like this hefker, this ownerless palace. Or perhaps, and here is the ambivalence, or perhaps it could mean the opposite. Tomar, would you say there's no one in charge of it? In this case, you would have to read Bira Doleket in the opposite way, that it's not a castle on fire, but a castle that's all lit up. All the lights are on. The castle is full of light. Obviously, there is a healthy civilization living in this castle. And all the rooms are occupied and well occupied. Two very opposite meanings, levels of meaning. We can't have them both at the same time. I don't think that this is that way, unless you go and do another midrash on top of this midrash. This midrash really wants to stop, it seems to me, at the idea of the more obvious meaning here, which is that this castle is so compromised, there's so much wrong with it, that it looks as if there's no one in charge. And here is Avram in a chaotic world, in a world that doesn't make sense, in a world of non-meaning. And Abraham, that's what Abraham is apprehending. He's looking around and he's very disturbed by it. It sits alav bal habira. The owner of the castle peered out at him. It sits. Lovely word. Hatzatza. Hatzatza is a glance. It's like the eyes of the owner of the castle meet Avram's eyes for a moment. So there's that flash suddenly, light, in this burning castle. And the owner says, Anihu balabira. I am the owner of the castle. So what the owner of the castle does here, right, it's not Avram has this feeling like a traveler that there's no one in charge of the world. The world is just senseless. And then someone who is called the owner looks out and accosts the traveler, meets his eyes, and says, I'm the owner. Doesn't explain anything. Why is the castle burning? Leaves the rest up for interpretation. Leaves the rest up to Abraham. What's he supposed to think now? One possibility is for him to think that the owner is telling him, well, you put out the fire. Well, might be one thing. Or I'm the owner and I need help from you. Might be one possibility. There may be others. But let's just stay with what actually happens without interpreting for the moment. What is the owner doing here? He's simply identifying himself. And this is what Avram is like. Avram Avinu was saying, Tomar shaholam hazeh belo manhig. Would you say that this world is without anyone in charge? With the sad, right, with the depressive meaning, with the skeptical meaning, right? It looks very much as if this world doesn't have anyone in charge of it. So God peeps out at him. There is a spark that goes from God to Abraham and tells him, Ani hu bal ha'olam. I'm the owner of the world. I'm in charge of the world. And then we go back to the bride. The bride whose husband now will desire her beauty. What does that do to the poetic strata of the Midrash here? The king will desire for your beauty, for he will be your Lord. And the Midrash tries to translate it. The king will desire your beauty, liyapotech ba'olam, to make you beautiful in the world. Strange translation. It's not that you come with beauty. The bride doesn't come with beauty, but it's a beauty that is revealed in the journey, right? In the encounter with the king. And it's a beauty that will go out into the world. It's an expansive beauty. Although it will come in a private relationship with the king, that's where the beauty will be effective. That's where it finds itself. Nevertheless, it will have an effect on the world. Liyapotech ba'olam. And the verse in Psalms ends, and you will bow down to him, Vayomer Hashem el Avram. So how has the Midrash dealt with the verse here? Seems to me the Midrash is saying here, this verse, Lech Lecha, with all its concrete meanings, contains deep within it a turbulent traveler, anxiety, a bride who is between places, a traveler who is between places. And not just as abstractions, but as someone, in each case, a bride, a traveler, what a traveler was in ancient times. It's no simple fate to be a traveler. What that means to the quality of one's subjectivity, who one is. It's not an external thing. It's something that affects layers of one's being. Layers of comfort are stripped off. Layers of the usual envelopes that contain one in life are stripped off. Let's move from there to the next midrash now. I'm sorry, no, to the Meir Shiloach. The Meir Shiloach, the Ishbitzer, it's one of his greatest passages. It's one of his most significant passages, it seems to me. Vayomer Hashem el Avram, number 7, begins with a quotation from Isaiah, an image that seems to have nothing to do with anything. Ki etzak mayim al sameh. If I pour water, indeed I shall pour water on the thirsty, and nozlim al yevasha, and fluids on dry ground. How does that translate then? How does the pasuk from Yeshayahu go on then? Etzok ruchi al zaracha ubirchati al tze'etzaecha. I will pour my spirit on your seed and my blessing on your offspring. Now there you have in Yeshayahu. And the Midrash is co-opting Yeshayahu now, bringing it into play. What is the point there in Yeshayahu? The prophet is saying in the name of God that I will deal with you as one deals with thirsty ground. I will pour water on thirsty ground and my blessing on your offspring. Now, they're not exactly the same, the two halves of the pasuk. That is, you yourself are thirsty, and I'll give you water. And then it will affect also those who come after you. That those who come after you will, in a way, be the gainers from this process of thirst and gratification that you have undergone. So there is a sense here, again, a vegetable sense. It's a sense of what the ground and the need to have offspring, the need to produce from the ground and the parched ground and the need for water. That is the ground as badly needing something that will release the creativity that's implicit within the ground. And that is the fluid. That's the water. That's the water and the earth that we've been talking about. And so the Ishbitzer evokes this for us. He wants us now to think in terms of that pasuk and stay with that as long as we need to. And then come back to Abraham. When Abraham began to seek out the root of his own life, he begins now to give us a story of Abraham, which he is basing on lech lecha, on those two words, and tradition. Go to yourself. In the end, he will say, lech le'atzmecha. Go to your very own self. Going to Eretz Yisrael is one layer of what you'll be doing. Right? Physically, you'll be traveling to Eretz Yisrael, perhaps because that's the only place you can do the spiritual work, or the journey to the place is where you can do the spiritual work. Well, what's the spiritual work? The spiritual work is that Abraham is desperately seeking the root of his own life. Yeah, it's a spiritual way of talking. It's a spiritual language that the Ishbitzer is using here. And he wants to say that the root of your own life, the search for that, the quest for that, is because Abraham has already understood that all the things that are called life by the world are not life. All the physical pleasures of the world, they're all there to facilitate life, to enable life in many ways, to make it easier, but that's not life. And what he's really searching for then, he's not looking to find the root of his life. He doesn't know what the root of his life is at all. And that's what it means to find. He's lost. It's as if he doesn't have a sensed root. And he looks at the world that everyone else seems to accept as being what life is all about. And he can't accept it. He says it's just not that. And so he is in this parched state. He's in this thirsty state. It's not a state of, it doesn't foreshorten the distance between one makom and another makom. You could have left the illusions of the world without immediately arriving at the truth. That's not exactly how it works. That you can go from one place to another place and never be satisfied. That's not it. And then we think, if you spent your whole life doing that, well, it would not be such a good thing. Or would it? Do we always need a neat ending to the story of the quest. When you are looking for the meaning of life, one story is you look and then you find. That's certainly a story, and I don't want to be too, mocking about it. That's certainly a story. Something of that maybe you even need from the beginning, you could say. Some inkling. You do want some resolution. You want some water for your thirst. But the water is not going to do any good unless you're good and properly thirsty. That's what the Me'er Shiloach wants to say. That's why he uses that image from Yeshayahu. If you're really thirsty, then you will really quest. And for that, you can't find answers so easily and so immediately. And so in the end, he comes around to saying, Amar lo, lech lecha, hainu le'atzmacha. Go to yourself, because really nothing else will do. Now, that is a surprise resolution. From a religious perspective, we think the idea should be, so go and find God. And the Me'er Shiloach knows that you're thinking that. That has to be the object of his quest, the root of his life. And what God is saying to him, according to the Me'er Shiloach, is, don't look outside, look inside. Don't look for things that are not essential to your inside life. That's where you will find the shoresh. It has to be inside. If you're going to find God, it has to be inside. That's the first stage, at any rate. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, who is an even more radical Hasidic master than the Ishbitzer, will say basically that's the first level of spiritual development. And it's a huge level, right? It's a very big achievement. Darga shel ani, the level of I, the level of taking one's subjectivity seriously and going deep inside oneself to find God. There will be later stages, perhaps, which are much more difficult and much more rarefied, but this first stage is hard enough. And that is what Avraham is. And here he is now. And what is happening now is that the God is peering out at him, and saying to him, basically, Hetzitz alav HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he makes something of that word, simple word, alav. Not elav, but alav. God is not saying to the traveler, he's just not just looking at the traveler and saying, look at me, I'm the master of the world. Hetzitz elav means he's saying to the traveler, look at yourself. Right? It's like when someone calls you in the street, and you look up and you see that person. The effect is that you see that person, but also you suddenly feel very self-conscious. Suddenly someone has singled you out as if you are in some way remarkable. And it's where you and says to you, become aware of yourself. You, like when someone calls out you. It can be a slightly unpleasant feeling to suddenly have the spotlight turned on one. Who, me? Oh. And the Ishbitzer is taking that very seriously. He's saying, yes, that's what it is. God is saying to him, look at yourself. Become aware of yourself. You are the one who's troubled by how the world is, and no one else is. Everyone else seems to be going on blithely. That should interest you. That you have a certain subjectivity, you have a sensibility that feels very badly. And the words that are used are words of turbulence, taromet, that you feel turbulent and unstable, and that there's something stormy inside you. Your soul is storming inside you. Become aware of that and of what that means. You're not just reacting to the outside world. You are in some way becoming aware of your own inner being. And that's not something to be taken for granted. So look at it, listen to it, re'i u'shema, because that's where growth can happen. That's where something can happen. And it's put here in this very direct way, really very challenging way. If you look at the right at the end there, where he says, Zeleshon Allah, that God, look here, God says to him, look at the difficulty you are having in life, the problem you are having, the things that doesn't make sense, the question, right? It's not just an intellectual question. It's an emotional problem that you're having. Look at that, because the question, in a sense, is the key to the answer. Right? He says it even more barely. He says that the question in itself is a kind of sufficient answer. Right? The question already, the troubled state of your soul already tells you everything you need to know. Well, or maybe it needs a little interpreting. But somewhere the sense of focusing on the self, and that's the Ishbitzer, of course, writing in the 19th century, with a modern perspective on subjectivity. And we can say many things about how it's affected by the age he lives in, and the people who surround him, and the Hasidic world, and many things about the emphasis on subjectivity as being the factor here. And I want again to add, and the text. That is in the text of the Torah. The Ishbitzer is not just saying, look, I'm being modern and psychological and psychoanalytic here. You know, we may say that about him, but he is saying, look at it, it's in the Torah. And he points to it in the Torah, in the Midrash, different layers of focus on it. In the Midrash, it's a little more focused. Hitzitz alav. God looks at him. In the Torah, it's very covered over. Lech lecha. Just so the simple bare words, go to yourself. And maybe you can only get to what it says in the Torah if you have read the Midrash and you've read the Mea Shiloach, and then you've read some more thinking of your own. And then it can take all kinds of layers of thinking and of feeling and of experiencing, finally to look back at the Torah and say, yes, but it started from there. That really is there in the Torah. I'm not just putting it out there onto the words of the Torah. Yes, well, we are way out of time. I don't know where the time went. Let me just touch on the next midrash, and I think we'll have to stop there. Number 8. Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Rav Brachya patach. Rav Brachya began his drasha. L'reach shmanecha tovim shemen turak shmecha. Your oils are fragrant, and oil. How can I translate this here?
Perfume.
Your perfume diffuse, right? Your perfume is decanted, right? Decanted, poured into another bottle. What's happening here? It's talking about, except for the verse from the Song of Songs about perfume, let's say. And Rabbi Brachya wants to say, no, it's about Avraham. Avraham now is not just a bride, but he is perfume. It's a wild, again, it's a different world suddenly that's evoked. This is like a flask of perfume. Avraham is like a flask of perfume, which is wedged into cotton wool. In other words, it's stabilized, it's not rolling around. It's well positioned and placed in a corner, so it can't move. But the result is that its fragrance does not diffuse. There is no movement outwards. It's closed in on itself. So when it was mitul telet, when someone got hold of it and tiltelota, uncorked it and shook it in the air, then hayarecho nodef, then its fragrance diffused in the world. And so God said to Avraham Avinu, Taltel atzmacha mimakom lemakom. Shake yourself up from place to place. V'shimcha mitgadel ba'olam. And then your name will grow in the world. And God is saying to Abraham here, apparently, Abraham is perfume, right? You have to be able to accept that conceit almost. It's such a far-fetched analogy, you might say. Abraham is perfume that is contained within itself. It's found a safe, closed place to be. And God says basically, agitate yourself. Open yourself up to a more agitated kind of existence, almost voluntarily. Here it's not a question of the fate of the journey. Here it's the bride who is destined in some way to go and marry this man. Here it's as if God is saying to Avram, there's a secret of tiltul. And tiltul is really a very uneasy word. It means being very uneasy. You know, I have a whole series of translations here for the word tiltul. Translations: to be unsteady, to be distracted, to be distraught, to be deranged, to travel, to swing, to hurl, to shake something up, to lose one's balance. It's as if God is instructing. He's instructing Avram on some unconscious level. When he's saying to him, Lech Lecha, it's like telltale, lech, right? It's an uneasy play with that root, lech. You may not have heard that when the first time you read Lech Lecha. You see, we're thinking in different directions, but the Midrash is pointing out, just listen to the words, Lech Lecha, Lech Lecha. That's not being steady. That is in some way introducing some turbulence into your life. Who in his right mind wants to do that? If I'm stable, I want to be stable. And so I have to think of this on the level of the unconscious. That is, that there's a sense in which he is not just an object. That is, a person who contains in himself a treasure of good perfume. And we look at him and then we want to smell him. And we want to enjoy his fragrance. He is perfume that has a self. There is a dream of perfume here. There's a dream of Avram as perfume. It's not rational. What does the perfume want? One part of it wants to stay stable and well corked up. But if the perfume is really perfume, it wants to diffuse in the world. There's something in it that wants. And that's the ambivalence. And that's the dream of the perfume that the Midrash is introducing us to here. Based on the words Lech Lecha. Now, it's not at all a clear product of those words. But the Midrash is very colorful and very, what should I say? Words are used in powerful ways here to try to get you to accept an alternative way of dreaming, the text of the Torah. Let's just touch on the next one, since I have just a couple of minutes maybe. And the next one just complicates things a little further. Instead of teltel atzmacha, the perfume diffusing out into the world, a pasuk is quoted from Psalms, Kuf Yud Aleph, Lecha tal yaldotecha. To you is the dew of your youth. Now, the connection between taltel and tal is my poem. Yes, that's because I put the two sources next to each other. Right, so I'm not making any further claims than that. But just look at the word dew here. The dew of your youth. To you is the dew. What is to you? Lech lecha. The Midrash wants to take the word lecha and see it as the common denominator between lech lecha and lecha tal yaldotecha. To you is the dew of your youth. What does the Midrash have to say about that verse? Abraham was anxious, he was in fear, and he said, would you say that I have sin in me, in my hand, because I used to worship idols all those years? And here is Abraham being anxious, no longer feeling stable. because suddenly he realizes that there's something very wrong about his youth. And this maybe is from a retrospective point of view, that he looks back at it at some point later. Maybe he's already a good distance on the journey. He's already found certain things and he's moved on. And now he looks back and he thinks, but my youth and the dew of your youth. Why is your youth, your sinful youth, that's now bothering you to remember? You're worried that maybe it's still there in me. After all, if I was once like that, then maybe I still am like that. Maybe I'm still back there. I haven't really changed. Now that's this what this Midrash wants to raise here. And therefore, it uses this image of dew. Why dew? God said to him, just as this dew, poreach, flies off in the air. That is, evaporates. Dew evaporates. That's what it does. It touches the plant, it touches the flower, and then evaporates with the sun, disappears. So your sins evaporate. An extraordinary image. That you have sinned, all right, but they're not dead weights inside you. Your experiences, in as far as you, are dynamic. They're in you, they affect you, and then it depends how they affect you. They can fly off and leave an effect behind, like dew on the flower. What does dew do to the flower? It just provides a touch of moisture. It doesn't flood the plants with rain. That's what the last sources on the page have to do with. I don't have time to look at them in depth. The difference between dew and rain, the Shem Mishmuel will say, is that rain comes and floods the earth and stays in the earth. And if your sins were like rain, then you really would be in trouble, because there would be the sense that some terrible force had entered you and flooded you and altered you forever. But that's not what they are. Your sins are like dew, and a dew is something. That's what one really needs in the world. One doesn't need rain, one needs dew. Now suddenly we've moved from Isaiah, from Yeshayahu, providing dew, providing water for the thirsty, to the effect, the very light effect, the very slight stimulating effect of the dew. What does the dew do? It touches off, says the Shem Mishmuel, your own inner forces. And that's what your sins have done to you. The dynamic of this is huge. Now, what is he saying in very brief terms? He's saying all your misunderstandings and mistakes of your misreadings of the world originally have provoked you. They have evoked from you a reaction. That's what experience is supposed to do. Experience is supposed not just to sink into you and lie like a stone, but to touch off something, to touch off like a hint, right? To hint something to you. And if one has a creative spirit, one responds to hints. And Abraham is now being told, don't worry about those sins, because they had a good effect on you. Why? Because you were able to transform them. You were able, those sins, you grew dissatisfied with them. You began to realize that can't be life. That's one form of response. In other words, you decided that's not it. You didn't necessarily throw them out violently. You just moved on from there, right? We don't need to worry about sins as an objective, concrete part of your eternal being. That's not the way it works. It works like life. And life works, right, through time, through space, through all the images one can bring to bear on delicate movements, on something moving that creates an ongoing life. So that what Avraham comes to represent through all these many midrashic sources is a lecha, a you, that is leaving something behind and becoming something new. That is in motion. Something he'll always yearn for. He'll always yearn for the land which I will show you. That will be a part of his way of being in the world, never to be fully and only where he is. That would be like to have a stone sunk in you, but always somewhere on tiptoe, always somewhere ready to move on to the next thing, which will in some way refine or develop where I already am. And that is, of course, it's a very Hasidic way of thinking. Development, movement, change. And again, I just say, but what I've said before, the argument I'm trying to make is then that what Hasidut does in modern times has its seeds in the Midrash, and the Midrash has its seeds in the text of the Torah. And I think it's a mistake to miss out those stages and to say, here you have wonderful, modern, creative Hasidic spirits giving life to the Torah. No, I feel about this rather strongly. If you are really go deep into it, you feel it in the text of the Torah. You just feel it. You hear it and you feel it. I was fortunate personally to be educated by my father, for whom this was clear. This was something, and therefore my earliest learning was imbued with that, the feeling of, but it's right in there. It's not something I'm thinking of to say about it. In some sense, it has its roots there. And then, of course, one acquires skills, and one acquires modern sensibilities and sophistication, and one learns all kinds of skills. But in the end, if it's authentic, you can sense that it had its spark, right? That there is a deep connection with its origins, that it grew out of something. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if there are any gentlemen here. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts? And I'm sorry that I had to rush so much there at the end.
Amazing.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Dara.
So do you think one could say, based on everything that you brought out from the poetic Lech Lecha, that Lech Lecha, your transformation of yourself, demands action, Lech. Like the apathy is what is counter to any growth. Yeah, the world is chaotic, but it's not bothering anybody. The world is on fire and that's the way it is. Whereas Lech Lecha, we've got to change that.
I think that's it. It's an activist. There is that activist level of, got to do something about it.
So God demanding activism here?
Sorry?
So is that God demanding this moral activism? It's not enough for Abraham to be that perfume of belief and faith in God. He's got to Lech Lecha. He's got to become an activist.
He's going to become an activist, but his main means is with a teaching. That he's going to walk around the world and teach, all these nomadic groups of people. But what that means in the depths, though, is it's an activism which is not a kind of crude, immediate activism. I'm going to go make a demonstration tomorrow in the streets. I think there's no problem with doing that. But where does that come from? Where can we engage with other people? And that has to be something from very deep. It means never looking at the world as if, well, that's just the way it is. It means a certain agitation. Well, you look at the world, and you think, but not in order to plunge down into something static, but in order to be mobilized on whatever level. Whether it's painting a painting or, there are many levels on which this can work. But I think somewhere that is Avraham. That's what Avraham stands for. Yes, Carol.
Two little things. One is when you were doing the Rambam, his phrase about breaking the idols, Lishaber Kol Hatzurot, really resonated with so much of what you've been saying.
Yes.
To break up the forms. It just
to
really
break up the
struck
forms.
me.
Very, very, very
really struck me.
That's really interesting. Yes, and of course it's interesting that the Rambam, even though he wants to get away from the mythic stories of the
Right.
child breaking the idols and all that, and he wants to make it an intellectual matter, he still has his Avram actually breaking the idols. It's
Right.
not just intellectually breaking, but he goes around. So there is that. The Rambam also, even the Rambam, and the rarefied level in which he's speaking, he knows that there's an energy that comes from a different level.
Also, though, I wish you would say a little more about the bride and the castle, because they seem like very opposite images. The fact that one's encased, in the bride image, I don't quite get it.
Well, you're right. Yes, I think there is something quite disturbing about that. As soon as you started saying it, I reminded myself of it. I'm not sure I have it all integrated in my. I think in some way one is supposed to feed off the other. They're obviously different, like the water that takes things apart and binds things together. That's why I began with that and maybe that disturbing combination in which two things are interwoven, and they really are interwoven, because the first part is broken off and is brought in at the end again. So it's as if really you're supposed to interweave the two stories. Doesn't so easily yield to meaning. It doesn't so easily yield to the end of the story, the conclusion of the story. And I'd almost say that's the nature of poetry also. I'm not trying to justify this midrash. I think we can work with it. But I think the nature of poetry, as opposed to story, is that the story looks for a happy ending. Not a happy ending, but an ending, a meaningful ending. And a poem, not necessarily. A poem works with things. And is what is produced is not necessarily, a product that you can touch.
As you were speaking, wait, as you were speaking now, I was just having some thoughts about it, which is, we'll both have this idea of the Baal, of the master, and then, so that's something they have in common. I'm not sure exactly, what to do. I mean? The bride going to her emphasizes that idea.
You're
that
right.
there is a master, and also now
that's
the fire.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yes.
The fire.
Yes,
is
everyone with us. Yeah, the husband and the owner of the castle are both called Baal.
And a sense of, I don't know. Well, two things. One, like a sense of confinement in the castle. I don't know, in a confinement in the marriage. You know what I mean? Like there is but also the Aish, I don't know. Now I'm associating Aish with passion. Do you know what I mean? Like there's like a confinement of the passion. Like
I think these are very fruitful things you just said. I'm not going to try to finish the job. But there is a lot to work with, but it's not a predetermined goal. We're not looking for the meaning. I think the midrash is being very provocative, and this is the midrash on Lech Lecha, I'd have to say.
I never knew about the bride part, though. I mean, you always hear about the castle, but I never
the context.
heard about
the context. Yeah. Very nice.
And I was struck by the fact that in the next generation, Rivka, in her brave way, is that bride who leaves her father's house and comes to her new man.
Another example of it, right out there in Pshat. Yes.
Avivah, the interweaving of these two scenes in the Midrash sounds like, I kept thinking of the Simon and Garfunkel song where he weaves parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, and those are two different songs, and two different stories are interleaved, and sometimes there's dissonance or polyphony, but it makes a larger harmony, which is not achieved by each one of the stories separately. And then the way they come together, it's very hard. As a child, as a kid, as a teenager listening to it, I did not get any of it, but only listening to it as an adult, I hear both the two, and it's only two levels, but when they are sung together, there's that polyphony, which we don't use anymore now in modern music, which is always provocative to me.
Which doesn't necessarily have a translation. There's no easy way of summing it up.
It goes beyond words.
Yes. So there's a mystery in poetry. Poetry leaves you somewhere with something you can't quite tie up. And I think that's part of the function of poetry. That's why people love and hate poetry. There is a book, very interesting, very short book called The Hatred of Poetry. I've gotten a lot from this book by Ben Lerner, if anyone wants to follow up. Very, very provocative, really goes deep. Yeah. Anyone else?
Yes, this is
Yes.
Ilana.
Susan? Was it?
Ilana.
Who is it?
Ilana, can you hear me?
Ilana.
Yes. Yes, I had a thought in another direction. In thinking about.
Could you speak a
Yeah.
little more close to the?
Yes. Is that better? Can you hear me
Yeah.
better?
Yeah.
Okay. In thinking about the Lech Lecha that God says to Avram as a kind of mirroring of God's Lech Lecha, that just thinking about the evolution of God as a character who begins with "it was good," and then we've just been immersed in all these stories of "it was bad," and let's destroy the creation, and then God arrives at this point. And so I was really struck in this shiur about God's story of reckoning with this kind of ambivalence and paradox, that God is at a point with Avram that it is neither all good nor all bad, and so perhaps it's God's Lech Lecha.
Yeah. Yes. I thank you for that. If we take it with the respect with which you gave it, yes, God as life, God as a living force, and in every way in which He affects us, it's because it's not just it's in us because it's in God. It's in us because God is not part of us, but we are part of God. Something like that. Yes, Susan. I can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was reminded of the shiur last year that you gave with that word tzitz with Shir Hashirim.
Yes.
And for me, that all connected the bride and the castle, this intimate, all-knowing flash of a look that sort of is also very mysterious, that creates intimacy and just all happens. And maybe we don't even understand how it happens, but affects us in a very deep way.
Yes, I like that. That's another way of interweaving. Yeah, he's not just your master. I mean, there's an erotic thrill about the word "your master."
Yes.
Yeah, which it means there is intimacy. It's not brutalism. We're not talking about something brutal. We're talking about a certain deep kind of intimacy, and that you have in both stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.